And our final speaker in this session is Matthew Tata. He's a professor in the Department of Neuroscience at the University of Lethbridge. He's also founder and CEO of Reverb Robotics, using auditory artificial intelligence, or developing artificial intelligence in the auditory sense for robots. His research program develops models of neural architectures to better understand how the brain solves, I would say, the computationally awesome challenges of vision and hearing. Dr. Tata.
Thanks very much, Jay. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be invited here in my kitchen to give this talk. My name is Matt Tata. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist at the University of Lethbridge. My background is in sort of sensory physiology, perception, and attention, but I'm very distractible, and so I've sort of dabbled in a lot of different things, most recently in robotics, and I want to tell you a bit about the sort of adventures that I've had along the way. Craig, can we have the slides up? Or do we have the slides up? Yeah, perfect. You can go ahead to the next slide. Cool, thanks. So the theme of the talk is, the whole conference is successes in neuroscience. And when I was asked to give a talk on my successes in neuroscience, I thought, do I have any successes in neuroscience? And I couldn't think of anything really that important. So I started thinking about what would it mean for a field to be successful, like the field of neuroscience, so I'm a cognitive neuroscientist. So what would it mean for cognitive neuroscience as a field to be successful? So if we start with the idea that, as cognitive neuroscientists, we think the brain is for perception, action, and cognition, very broadly construed. So a successful, what would be a successful cognitive neuroscience? I love this quote by Richard Feynman. He said, "What I cannot create, I do not understand." And so by that definition, a success of cognitive neuroscience would be to build artificial systems that exhibit perception, action, and cognition. So that's what the talk is sort of about. About 5-6 years ago now, I kind of got bored with the routine of write some papers, argue with reviewers, do some more experiments, write some more papers, argue with more reviewers. And I decided I really wanted to build something, like actually create a thing that would just do something in the real world. And so I spent a whole year at the Italian Institute of Technology working with this fantastic robotics group that works in the field of cognitive robotics. And their philosophy is that robots should interact very intuitively with humans. And the way to go about that, one way to go about that, is to design humanoid robots. The idea, the logic being that if a robot works like a human, it has the same parts as a human, it has the same kind of perception and cognition systems as a human, it'll be very easy for humans to interact with it. So I started working with this robot called iCub. If we go to the next slide, you'll see a video, hopefully, of iCub. So I can tell you a little bit about this robot. Yeah. Some people find him really cute. Some people find him a little bit uncanny valley and kind of creepy. But there he is. That's iCub. There's about 40 iCubs in the world. Very advanced humanoid robots. They have 57 degrees of freedom, so 57 joints. Their hands are almost human-like because they're meant to be a platform for research in human-robot interaction. Very advanced cameras for a visual system. Everywhere that you see in this robot that's black is capacitive touch sensors, like the screen of your phone. So it has a somatosensory system. It has force torque sensors in the joints. So it has a proprioceptive system. It has accelerometers to be like a vestibular system. And when I got there in 2013, they had developed this fantastic artificial visual system for the iCub and had done no work on the auditory system. And I'm an auditory scientist of sorts. So I set about working on the auditory system for the iCub. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So in cognitive robotics, and robotics in general, often what we do is we set about to solve what we call toy problems. So a toy problem is like a behavior that we want the robot to do that, like if we know the robot can solve that problem, can do that behavior, we know we've solved some key problem that we're trying to figure out. And so the toy problem that we set out to solve with iCub was to get it to follow a conversation. So imagine there's two people talking, the iCub can see the faces, and it couldn't hear the voices, and all we wanted to do is turn to look at the person who's talking and then turn to look at the next person. We can break that problem down into a couple of subproblems and start to find the computational solutions to those. One of the problems would be to find the onset of a new voice in time. When does the new auditory object appear in the auditory scene? And one would be to find the onset of that voice in space, the space around the robot, so that it can turn and look. And what we found was that the solutions to these problems, and in fact, the solutions to almost all the problems that you encounter in robotics, were already discovered by nature in the evolution of brains and nervous systems. So I want to kind of hit on a few of the links that I discovered that I think are really beautiful as we went through this process. Okay, Craig, go ahead to the next slide. So we worked on the problem of how to register new objects. How does the brain register new auditory objects in my lab using electroencephalography, EEG? And what we discovered was that when the auditory scene is broken down into its frequency components, when the brain detects that there's a reorganization of energy in the spectrum, it registers that event as a new auditory object, even if there's no change in the actual acoustic energy in the scene. So it doesn't get louder or quieter, it just changes its spectral configuration. The brain is super sensitive to that. We wrote a few papers about that. So we decided to model that. We modeled the frequency decomposition of the scene as a bank of what are called gamma tone filters. And gamma tone filter is sort of a model of the basilar membrane of the auditory system. And then we developed this sort of notion of acoustic salience. So how dramatically has the spectrum reorganized? So you can say, okay, the auditory scene has just experienced this dramatic change in the salience, the acoustic salience. We'll say that's a new auditory object. But now we have to sort of handle that object. Craig, go to the next slide, please. Okay, so we know from a lot of cognitive neuroscience, a lot of perception neuroscience, that the brain is object-oriented. So I wrote a sort of event handler that was object-oriented for the iCub, for auditory events. And so you can think of it as a sort of stack. So a new auditory object is detected in the scene. If its salience exceeds, so it's tagged with some salience, the salience has a time decaying function. And if the previous object is lower in salience than the new object displaces it on the stack, and that whatever object is on the top of the stack, that's what the iCub is listening to. And it sounded great, except it didn't work. And the reason was because the system would try to find any object. As long as the salience was greater than the previous object, it would try to attend to that. And so it would just ping pong around constantly trying to find something in the auditory scene. Craig, go to the next slide, please. The solution was something that might be familiar to many of the cognitive neuroscientists out there. The solution was the default mode network. So the default mode network was discovered some 10 years ago or so. And it's a network of brain areas that are engaged when you don't give the brain anything else to do. So when there's no particular task, these default mode areas start to light up. And what I discovered was that if you make a default mode object, you automatically put it on the stack, and new events have to compete with that default mode object to displace it in order to become the object that's selected by attention. And that made the whole system much more stable. So Craig, go to the next slide. The next step was to figure out where sounds are coming from in space. And there's a huge, beautiful classical literature on auditory localization that's mainly based around neural systems that are sensitive to differences in phase and loudness between the two ears. And I won't go into the details of all that, but I encourage you to look that up if you haven't ever read some of the early work by Lloyd Jeffress and Catherine Carr and Eric Ludson, Mark Konishi. It's fantastic stuff. It turns out that, so we had already broken down the auditory scene using these gamma tone filters into their spectral components. We had to break down the auditory scene into now spatial information, and you can model these neural circuits using an algorithm called beamformer. So we implemented a bunch of frequency-tuned beamformers to model the binaural interactions of the brainstem. And okay, so Craig, if you go to the next slide, what you end up with now is the auditory scene decomposed into its spectral dimension, frequency, and its azimuthal spatial dimension. And so you get this sort of instantaneous egocentric map of the auditory scene, which, not coincidentally, has exactly the same dimensions as the inferior colliculus. So we see already this, as we go along, this sort of parallel computational principles. Okay, so if you register salience, co-register in frequency and space, and you kind of feed that information into the visual system that controls gaze, you get the iCub to exhibit this toy problem behavior. Go ahead to the next slide.
1, 2, and then we need a chart.
Oh, what? Oh, yeah. You'll scare him.
You first.
So, Francesco, what do you think of this iCub?
First, let's see. Hello, iCub. Oh, yeah.
Hello, iCub.
Not always. Let's see if you should click something. Hello, iCub. Hello, hello. Oh, that's the person.
I think he likes you better than me, because he seems to like to attend to you instead of me.
Not you see.
Hello, iCub. How are you? Okay, thanks. Craig, next slide, please. So that's the iCub. One of the problems that you run into with any binaural system that finds sounds in space is something called spatial ambiguity. It can produce these phantom sound images. And this problem was actually handled discussed by a guy named Hans Wallach in the 1930s. And he suggested, correctly, that just rotating your head will actually solve those spatial ambiguities. So we modeled that using a Bayesian system. We know the brain is a Bayesian inference generator. So we created this Bayesian AI system that takes egocentric instantaneous maps of evidence that are in the dimensions of frequency and space. And it kind of overlaps them and accumulates a posterior probability distribution of where sounds are probably coming from as the robot moves its head around. And it works. And interestingly, it also solves the so-called cocktail party problem. But that's a totally different talk. If you integrate all of this stuff together, you get a behavior like what's on the next slide. So this is one of my current students, Lucas Grass, who's in Italy.
Oh, fine. I went to the cinema to watch Joker. Did you watch it?
Yeah, I went and watched it, but it was really interesting actually because it was in Italian, so it took a little bit for me to get used to what was going on with the characters. But it was really cool seeing the backstory of the Joker and some of the other characters from other Batman movies, such as The Dark Knight Rises. Have you seen any other Batman movies?
Oh, no, likely not.
Okay, so that's the iCub orienting. Thanks, Craig. Go to the next slide, please. I just want to mention just very briefly some of the stuff that we're working on now. So, of course, one of the most exciting things going on in artificial intelligence right now is these very powerful deep neural networks, especially recurrent neural networks. And they can solve all sorts of fantastic perception problems. But what's interesting is that even the computer scientists who design these networks don't always know how they work. And we think it might be an interesting problem actually for a neuroscientist to tackle, because we know that the brain is solving similar problems. So we've started studying the recurrent neural networks that are used for speech recognition. And so what we're doing in the lab actually is we're using EEG to measure brain activity. And so we have human listeners and artificial neural networks listening to exactly the same sentences. And we use the same analytic techniques that we use for human EEG. We apply those to the neural networks, to the activation functions of the recurrent layers of the neural networks. And what we're finding is that trained but not untrained neural networks seem to capture some of the same temporal dynamics that you see in human EEG, listening to the very same sentences. So we think this is a really interesting new approach to try to understand not just how the human brain works, but how these fancy neural networks also work. Okay, and the next slide, please. Okay, so to summarize, it's probably no surprise to any of us that nature has already found computational and biomechanical solutions for these difficult problems that any living thing has to try to solve: perception, action, and cognition. And I think one of the truest tests of any field would be to create the artificial systems that are models of what we study in the human brain. And I definitely think that discovering those links between artificial systems and human systems and drawing inspiration for artificial systems is the most rewarding thing that I've done as a neuroscientist. Next slide, please. So I have to thank a whole lot of people, my whole lab in Canada over several years, and of course our friends and collaborators in Italy at the Italian Institute of Technology. Thanks very much.
There, I unmuted myself. Thanks a lot, Matthew. We're going to bring back the other two speakers for a roundtable, but before or during, while we do that, there's something there's a connection that I might have missed. We were talking about the default network as being important to begin the interpretation of where sounds are coming from. It sounds puzzling to me because I always understood the default network to be wandering, like the mind wandering. So can you explain to me how does it just, among the things it's wandering about, it picks out the locations of sounds?
So I think what's important about mind wandering and the default mode network is that it's a task. It's an active task for the brain to be engaged in, but it displaces the sort of peripheral kinds of information that are coming in. So the brain is always being deluged by sensory information. And it's the job of the attention system to decide, to sort that out and decide, should I attend to this thing now, or should I ignore it? Should I attend to this thing now, or should I ignore it? And so the auditory system that we had developed was what we would call stimulus driven. So it would just respond to any stimulus. And if there's no default mode network, if there's no active mind wandering that occupies the mind, artificial or real, biological, then it's just responsive to any stimulus, anything that's out there in the scene. But if it has something that's salient that it can work on internally, then that can sort of keep out the slight distractions and outcompete the slight distractions. But when something really big happens out there in the world, it overrides the default mode network, kind of takes over. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, so yeah, wandering is an awkward word because it suggests lack of direction, but that's not really what's happening. Yeah. I would also say very quickly that when it comes to the uncanny valley, I think clowns are more like that than robots.